My question is, how do we compound returns on the investments in urban science? And I'm not here to speak for industry, although I am imagining that some of them are sitting there quite carefully thinking about what municipalities across the world and governments across the world are going to be doing, because of course this is a domain that is easily monetized. But I think that we have to ask a slightly different kind of compounding question. There are already more urban people living in the world today than there have ever been. And what that means is that the ideas of today are going to be profoundly influential for more people than have ever been before. As people come into the cities, we make cities, and they live those lives. So I hate to tell you this, but you're going to be more influential than Jane Jacobs. You're going to be more influential than Patrick Geddes. It's the truth. So we need to think carefully, very carefully, about what we do and how one engages with the question of urban transformation. And I'm going to borrow from a book which we've just put out called Cities Rethought, just for a mechanism to think about that. And the first thing that we argue in that book, which came out of, lovely to see Juan here from the Peak Project and others, the first thing we say there is you need to be asking normative questions about cities. And people in the box today have asked a lot of normative questions. I suspect when we later on, we'll get into more operational kinds of questions of kind of, well, really, how do you do it and what does it mean? But we've asked a lot of normative questions. So I don't want to put normative questions onto the agenda, but I do want to say that we have to prioritize the normative questions, because all questions are important, but some questions are more important than others. So we need to think very carefully and judiciously about that. Asking the question is one thing, but what that does then is it takes us to the task of saying, so how do we understand the question? Seen an example of that. What are we asking about it? And we talk about an exercise there of analytical redescription, where you hold the normative question, we want to change things, at the same time as you're asking the question of how does this work? What do I need to know in order to do this stuff? And urban science has to take that complex task seriously. And that means politics, it means culture, it means data, it means all of the things it means understanding infrastructure, it means understanding finance. We know those things, but there is no substitute for being robust in the way that we know our cities. We can't lose that capacity to know the city. We can't retreat, in other words, into the computational world. And finally, I just want to say that what we pick up on there lastly in Cities Rethought, which I think is helpful for us to think about, is the domain of operation. How do you make this happen? Okay? We started with a normative question. You only ask normative questions when you want to change things. And I think the climate community have been quite good about setting out what do they want to achieve, how do they think that might be achieved. Maybe we're beginning to get there in the health or the biodiversity spaces, and there would be very different answers if you looked at water or if you looked at any other sector. And I think, so there are both sectoral challenges, and then there are those synthetic problems that we know about. That if you're the city finance person or a global treasurer, you've got to make, again, that prioritizing kind of question. And some things are politically possible and others are not. And so the space of the operational becomes really, really important for us. And one of the things we talk about there is about, so how then do you do it? You can't do that. We're not going to be a Geddes or a Jane Jacobs. We're going to work collectively. And finding the pulse is really important. Recognizing your community is really important. And finally, I don't want us to lose this idea that embedding and institutionalizing, perhaps in what you teach, is really, really critical as we begin to answer these questions.